United States
Hmm.
essentially controls international shipping lanes around the world. They control the global order of how things get moved around. And as we know, shipping something overseas is like 10 times cheaper, 20 times cheaper sometimes than shipping it over land. So the way globalization is, the foundation of it is international shipping lanes that the United States is essentially in charge of. So the
Hmm.
question is, as the US sort of turns more insular, we see a bit of this with respect to this current conflict again, Russia Ukraine, where we're not even at the negotiation table. We're not mediating it. It's Israel and France who are trying to play that role, or it's actually playing that role with regards to mediating the Russia Ukraine conflict. Famously, just a couple weeks ago, the UAE and Saudi crown prince didn't take President Biden's callback, and so there's that aspect. Part of that is sort of this administration that some of our allies don't trust, the Biden administration, but part of it is a trend of the United States sick of being the policeman in the world. I think the polls pretty much bear that out. Both parties have a sense that our interventionist strategies, we should tone that back, to say the least. If the United States continues to go towards this more insularly focused trend, we're going to work on ourselves, right? First of all, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the United States is probably going to be more focused on itself and not as much on the rest of the world going forward, regardless of the candidate? Number one. Number two, does that create a vacuum that causes conflicts around the world? Where do you see those conflicts?
With your permission, let me answer number two first, and
Sure.
that'll give us the context for answering your first question. You're absolutely right, Ashton. Power abhors a vacuum, right? One of the most famous adages in human history. And if the United States is not leading the way in protecting international shipping lanes, then that void will be filled by others. And right now, for the foreseeable future, that void would be filled by China in the Indo Pacific region. They really are the only other major country with the kind of naval power projection capability. And they would certainly seek to dominate the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Western Pacific, essentially everything between the Philippines and Hawaii, where the U.S. is now the predominant force. They would also probably look to project power into the Indian Ocean because that really is the maritime superhighway that
Hmm.
connects Chinese markets to both oil and natural gas supplies from the Middle East, but also through the Indian Ocean to the African continent for natural resources that China needs for many of its manufactured goods, and then through the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea to European markets to be able to put those finished goods to market. So the Indian Ocean is also a vital shipping lane for China, and you would probably see China and India contest for supremacy in that part of the
Mhm.
world. And then, of course, you would have countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, highly dependent on those shipping lanes, then looking to counterbalance to see how they're able to work with China and India so they're able to continue with their significant energy exports to Asian and to European markets. And in Europe, without the United States in place there, you would almost certainly have very difficult tensions between Russia on the one hand and Britain and France on the other, two nuclear powers in Europe, both with very powerful naval forces. And so you would have, if not chaos, you would have competition and constant rivalry around the Eurasian landmass and along the eastern coast of the African continent. That's what
Hmm.
one would first imagine a U.S. withdrawal would lead to. Which leads me to point number two. It's why I don't believe the U.S. will do so anytime soon. And there may be a greater desire on the part of the American people for the U.S. to pull back from many of its commitments. But let me offer a couple of my own thoughts here, Ashton, if I might. My own sense is that the American people are not war weary, even though we have been through 20 years of war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But my own sense is reading the polls and talking to people as I travel around the country is they wonder why the United States doesn't win wars anymore. So
Hmm.
they'll support the U.S. military. It's our most trusted institution. And if
Right.
there is a compelling U.S. interest abroad, they'll support the president and the Congress if they dispatch forces to accomplish a goal, but to win. In other words, send our forces there and let them do the job that needs to be done and not engage in this kind of nation building and liberal humanitarian interventionism that many of us, and I'll include myself very honestly, thought maybe 20 years ago in the wake of the September 11th attacks was a necessary tool for foreign policy and diplomacy, especially in the broader Middle East and Northern Africa. And 20 years of essential failure has made very clear that liberal interventionism is also a failed policy. And that's why
Hmm.
we have to be careful with Ukraine. As heart wrenching as these images are of 10 million displaced Ukrainians, almost 4 million of them have become refugees spilling over into Europe. is the situation in Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia a genuinely compelling U.S. strategic interest that is worth risking the potential exchange of nuclear weapons
Right.
between Moscow and New York, or Moscow and Washington, or major European capitals? So I think it's very important that we find a way to bring about, for instance, in this case, a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And
Mhm.
you mentioned before, Ashton, that there are a number of leaders who are hedging their bets. You're looking at the Saudi Arabia kingdom, you're looking at the United Arab Emirates, and you also note, say, the role of the Israelis in looking to
Right.
play an intermediary role in negotiations. I would add to the Israelis the role of French President Emmanuel Macron and Turkish
Mhm.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who are trying to keep doors open to both Russia and Ukraine, bring about a ceasefire, and bring an end to the war so that we can then figure out politically and diplomatically how we move this process forward. But to have this war continuing with no particular objective in sight, realistically speaking, at least to date, I haven't heard of a strategic interest coming from Washington or from Brussels, except to continue to arm the Ukrainians to beat back the Russians, which will come at tremendous cost to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian economy, to Ukrainian society. And who's going to rebuild all of this? And how do we know we're going to do this without escalation to a chem bio attack, a major cyber attack
Right.
on a European or American infrastructure or energy grid, or God forbid, Vladimir Putin actually launches a tactical nuclear weapon against a military facility in Ukraine, or even worse, inside of a European country that's not in the NATO alliance?